Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's session. And thanks, Will, for agreeing to giving a talk. So I'll just give a short introduction. Then we're going to go into the presentation, and then all the questions we will save for later for hopefully a very fruitful discussion. So the WMO has recently published a new volume of guidance on impact-based forecasting and warning services. And this volume is building on the influential guidelines that were originally published in 2015. So Dr. Will Lang leads the WMO Expert Team, which developed this additional guidance and manages the UK Met's Office Weather Warning Service. In his presentation today, he will explore several key aspects of the guidance using the February 22 storms across Northern Europe as an example, with a particular focus on the importance of partnerships, early action, and effective risk communication in warning for severe weather. Will, over to you, and thank you. I will be sharing your slides.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Marlene, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity for giving this presentation. So as Robert said, we're going to talk a bit about several things, really. I want to talk a bit about the new WMO impact-based forecasting guidance, or at least the new version of it, part 2. And also I'm going to give you some personal experiences of some very recent weather that affected the UK and how I think we managed to put a lot of these impact-based warnings ideas into practice. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Robert. Thank you. I'm going to start off, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, just for background context. And then I want to take a real step back and really want to think about what impact-based forecasting actually is, what it's for. So we'll go in a little bit of a philosophical direction very briefly. And then we'll come to talk about the new WMO guidance itself, and a bit about the history of WMO and impact-based forecasting, or IBF, as I will refer to it from now on. Then I'll give you a quick summary of some of the key messages, by no means all of it, but a few of the key points from the new part of the guidance. And then I'll spend the last 15 minutes or so of 30 to 40 minutes talking about these February 2022 storms. And then very finally at the end, we'll tie it together and see what other information is coming about and will become available around impact-based forecasting and where to find it. So before we move on, I wanted to say really again that IBF doesn't really make things any easier for us as professional meteorologists. In fact, the week that we'll talk about later on was probably the most busy week I've ever faced in my career. That was true of my team as well. Indeed, some of us completely burnt ourselves out within the space of a week, but we do think it was worth it. And we'll show you the evidence of that later on. The other thing I wanted to say is that the more I over the years have started to talk about impact-based forecasting and warning, the more I began to think that really the meteorology bit was the easy bit, and it's the so what. So it's the impacts, and that's the harder bit, and that's the bit that's been the biggest challenge for us over the last 10 years. Lately, though, I've started to think I might have changed my mind, and maybe the impacts are now one of the easier bits as well. And it's everything else that's needed for good warning service, good impact-based warning service, which is actually much harder. Or at least something that perhaps pushes us outside of our usual comfort zone, particularly those of us who are on the physical science side of meteorology by training, etc. Sorry, next slide, please, Robert. Yeah, so about me, I've been a weather forecaster for 24 years now. I joined the UK Met Office in 1998. I've spent a lot of that time in operational shift working roles. I was a chief forecaster for 6 years. Before that, I was chief hydrometeorologist in our flood forecasting centre. But I've also spent a lot of time on the interface between operational forecasting and services. So that's services for government, also services for business, industry, etc. My current job is head of civil contingencies. I've been doing that for 4 years, which means that I'm in charge of the warning service. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on, how it works in the UK, how it is impact-based. I am also responsible for the severe weather advice that we give to government and to emergency responders. And again, that has a specific meaning in the UK. We'll talk about that later on. I also lead a team of 18 advisors, civil contingencies advisors, as we call them. And these are a team of mostly meteorologists, but all expert communicators. And it's our job to be that bridge between the Met Office science and the forecasts and useful information for emergency protection. I do a lot of work internationally. I've been working in the WMO expert teams around public weather service for over 10 years now. And for the last couple of years, I've been chair of the expert team on general service delivery. And that's the team that is responsible for, amongst other things, the impact-based forecasting guidelines. I also do a lot within Europe as well. I used to be the chair of the working group for cooperation between European forecasters, and I'm one of the originators of European storm naming and also the way that storm naming works in the UK. So it was myself and Gerald Fleming from Met Éireann who originally devised the original UK island storm naming scheme that was launched in 2015-16 and is now extended to cover our colleagues in the Netherlands as well. And so one of my proudest moments was seeing that storm naming turning up in a children's comic here in the UK a couple of years ago. Anyway, as I said, we'll move in a slightly philosophical direction and think what the point is of weather forecasts and warnings. And they really have to do something. I hope we all agree with that now. So this is like the tree falling in the forest argument. You know, if a forecast is issued and no one sees it, has it ever really been issued? And does it have any value at all? And I think a good warning service is not just defined by the accuracy and the reliability of the underlying forecasts. Obviously, we do need all of that, and we need all the NWP capability, all of the science, all of the observations which underpin that. But that's only really the start of it. And I think a good impact-based warning service is also relevant. Of course, it's accessible to users, whoever they may be, and it's understood. And understanding is only part of it, and we'll come back to this again later on. You have to trust that information, and then ultimately you have to act upon it. And I always come back to something which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is Brian Golding and others' valleys of death model, which I've got on the bottom left there. And really, I think there's a lot of emphasis in what we've been looking at in the Met Office in the last few years on those final valleys and recognizing that that's been a bit of a gap in our armory so far. So understanding the socioeconomic side of things, understanding the communication science and how actual people make decisions on the basis of that information. So as I said, the meteorology is only a part of it. The impact is only a part of it. It's what you do with that information that makes it really important. And I want to ask a question really is, can you think of examples of bad warnings and what does that even mean? So on the next slide, please, Robert, we'll explore that if we may. So what is a bad warning? And I want you to imagine a severe weather event for which, and you're going to have to click a lot here, please, Robert. Sorry. Okay, so let's imagine the meteorological forecasts are exactly right. So that's the what the weather will be side of things. And then we might consider that we've modeled all of the impacts exactly right as well. So that's the weather, what the weather will do. And usually that's the way that we define, you know, the paradigm shift towards impact-based forecasting. But is that enough? So you can have both of those, but you could have either a case where nobody knows about those forecasts and warnings, or everyone knows about them but does nothing, or probably worst of all, everyone knows about them but does the opposite of what they should based on that warning. And there's an example which I'm never sure whether it's true or not, but there was a story going around in the UK a few years ago. The east coast of the UK, along with other North Sea coasts in Europe, are quite susceptible to coastal flooding, especially when storm surges coincide with spring tides. Anyway, a while back we had an event where there was a storm crossing the North Sea and potential for some severe flooding, a risk of at least, in some coastal towns in eastern England. Warnings were issued, so the Met Office issued wind warnings. Our colleagues in the flood agencies in the UK also issued severe coastal flooding warnings as well. Now, as a result of those warnings, rumour has it that more people went into the affected coastal areas than went out of them. So the warnings were incredibly accurate and in many ways well communicated, very, very visible. But in terms of the response that it provoked, for some reason, it had exactly the opposite response. And I would say that that is really falling at that final valley of death is the understanding and the decision making. That's got to be right. It's got to inspire the right action. And maybe that is our definition ultimately for a good and a bad warning. So that's one point. I mean, maybe impact-based forecasting is really just a misnomer now. It's become so much more than that. The impact part of it is really, really important, but to do the impacts thing right and to make sure that that information is acted upon, there's so much more to it. And that's where all of that communication aspect comes in. Anyway, next slide, please. So let's take a look at the WMO involvement in impact-based forecasting, IBF. And we talk a lot about WMO 1150, which is the guidelines document, which now has two parts. And that was originally released, part one, in 2015 by the WMO Public Weather Service expert teams. Now, a few years later, after that was released, a lot of us in those expert teams realized that a lot of people we were talking to were using the guidance, and that could be Met services using it in their home nations, but also other Met services developing capacity building guidance for working with other Met services in other countries, for example. And it seemed to be growing in importance. And we wanted to recognize that. We also recognized that there was a lot of expertise developing in the community that we wanted to capture and make sure that firstly, the guidance was correct, and also that there could be new guidance created to help everyone else and get this sort of a momentum behind this evidence around and practice around impact-based forecasting. So we organised a symposium on impact-based forecasting that was held where I am today, here at Met Office HQ in Exeter in December 2019. Really, really interesting meeting. Lots and lots of experts from around the world in impact-based forecasting, multidisciplinary as well. And we decided that we wanted to update the guidance. And so the main action of that meeting was that we were going to do a new version of the guidance, part two. And that was took a while. COVID got in the way, but we pulled it all together, and that was ultimately published towards the end of last year. And that is now called WMO 1150 Part 2, Putting Multi-Hazard IBFWS into Practice. And that's what it's all about, really. It's about making something useful, usable, and used, which is obviously a bit of a cliche on our world, but it's really, really valid, and it's valid for this guidance as well as for the warning themselves. We really, really wanted to include a lot of that case study, those case studies. As I said, there's been a huge amount of IBF development, lots and lots of different variations on it around the world, and we wanted to gather that together to show that it is not just a single thing. It is not a single methodology. It's a philosophy that can be applied in different ways, and indeed will be applied in different ways in different countries, depending on the various risks and various organizational setups in each country. We really wanted to gather together all of that expertise. So there were 30 different authors, some of which are on the call with us today. It included representatives from Met Services, Disaster Reduction and Civil Protection authorities, so DRCPAs, as they're referred to in the guidance. We had a sizable contribution from academia, not just on the meteorological side of things, but it was very welcome to have input from the social science side of things as well. And we wanted to have a lot of input, and did have a lot of input from NGOs, and that goes from World Bank, etc., but also Red Cross and others. And there is a lot of experience in applying IBF in the specific cases of the voluntary and community sector, for example. And we also recognized that this was an ambitious task, and this was just going to form one part of a growing body of literature and experience around impact-based forecasting. So we weren't going to just publish this guide and say that's the end of it. It was going to be, this is just one part of it, and there's more. And we wanted to have a way where we could point people towards this and continue to grow this information over the coming years. So this slide here just shows what's in the two versions of the guide, part 1 and part 2. And part 1 is really where the fundamentals of the concepts, the theory come from, really. So the key concepts involved introducing ideas like the risk matrix, but also recognizing that there are different ways in which our organizations and our Met services might evolve towards impact and impact-based forecasting. It is not a one-size-fits-all methodology. What that guide proposes is that each of us and each of our nations should work out what's best for them, but there will be different applications of an impact-based philosophy wherever you are. It talks about the recommended elements of IBF services and also how we manage some of those services. And there's a clear overlap with other WMO strategies, such as the service delivery strategy, which includes kind of obvious things like understanding of users, continuous review of services and how you update them, etc. So that's the fundamentals document. The new document gives an additional 6 chapters. And they are as follows. So we have an introductory chapter on partnerships, which is fundamental, I believe. I don't think we can do impact-based forecasting without partnerships. Certainly something we cannot do by ourselves as meteorologists and Met services. There are 2 chapters on communications. One is on the broader aspects of communication. One is a little bit more specific about the field of risk communication, which is a whole subject in itself, and is worthy of lots and lots of further study. Indeed, it feels like this section is almost out of date now, because we have so many lessons to learn from how risk has been communicated across the world to do with the COVID pandemic. And I'm sure we have many opportunities to translate that into the meteorological arena in the coming years. Then there is an additional chapter on impact information, how you make sure that you know what's going on, how can you classify that information, and how you can use that to create and then verify impact-based forecasting. The value of impact-based forecasting and warning services is a really important chapter, I think, because it's still very important that we as organizations involved in IBF can justify why we're doing it. So this is where we're showing the socioeconomic benefit, lives saved, just the monetary value of things. And that can often be the main argument that we take to our stakeholders and our owners in government for justifying a change to an impact-based forecasting service, which might be a major change of philosophy for many Met services. And also training. There's no point in trying to do this unless we all know what we're doing, we know where to go for, we know how to share experiences and teach others how to embrace this philosophy. So that's the new guide. I'm really only just going to dwell on 2 of those components now, because they're the ones which are most relevant to the recent events I want to talk about. Partnerships. The way that we break it down in the chapter in the new guide is to think about who does a Met service or another provider of warnings need to really concentrate on partnering up with, and it's very wide ranging. You need to do all of these things. We've got to consider the way that we interact with users, end users, the public, emergency responders, etc., as a partnership. And so co-development of services is really, really important. Research and development, both within our own organizations, but also many other organizations, institutes on the science side of things and the social science side of things, and perhaps most important of all. And that also links into understanding communications and communications theory, which is not just an academic exercise, it's also things that we can learn from the media, from marketing and business, etc. A lot of lessons to learn, a lot of partnerships to be created there. Then there's the emergency responders, the DRCPAs themselves, and crucially the decision making, which may be the same kind of thing. So who are the people who make the big decisions on behalf of others? Maybe that's community leaders, maybe that's people who are responsible for civil protection in a particular city or state or something like that. How do we engage with them? How do we make sure that our services are tuned to what they want? And also having a close contact with all of the sources of information. Info-based forecasting is reliant on it being a two-way process. And we need to get as much information we can to both design the service in the first place and to be able to operationally run the service. So that's the partnerships aspect. And on the next slide, we'll talk about communication as well. And this is where it clearly goes well beyond our comfort zone of traditional meteorology. What we're doing here is application of social science, and media and marketing techniques, and communication theory, as I just said. A lot of it is around understanding and reaching your audience, or in fact, recognizing that you might have multiple audiences. And those might just include a priority to reach at-risk or hard-to-reach groups, and that might need to be done in different ways. So we talk about tailoring, which is a way of saying that, okay, we've got limited resources. We cannot give individual warnings to all individuals and all organizations in society, but we can cluster them into groups and perhaps message them in a slightly different way to make sure that we optimize decision-making and acting. So that requires a knowledge of all of these different groups and what their particular triggers are. And it also requires that we build influence within these groups. And that might be via social media, that might be through influence within communities, etc. But we need to be able to reach them. We need to be able to influence them, and they need to trust us. And then that gives us the authority. So what gives us the authority when we need to say, look, there's some severe weather on the way. We think you should do this. And then for people to do it. And again, it's all about actions, the correct actions. We also talk in the guidance about doing that by making best use of multiple channels. So a modern Met service will have lots and lots of different ways of connecting with different audiences. And in fact, different audiences might favor different channels. Recent example in the Met Office and in the UK storms, for example, we got a lot of positive feedback for our use of TikTok, which is something which is completely beyond me as a 50-something male, but is something that is a good way of reaching a particular demographic, a particular audience, and inspiring action if it's done in the right way. So how to cover all of these different audiences efficiently, making best use of different channels. And then how to make sure that they understand the case for action. And this is where things like risk perception come in. Do people understand that they are at risk? Do people understand that their families, their communities are at risk? And then what can they do to help mitigate that risk? And then there's a final section in the, in that chapter in the new guidance around specifically how we communicate for early action. And by which I mean in a way that interacts with other major actors, and this might be NGOs such as the Red Cross, for example, who run FBF schemes. And if you don't know what that is, it's forecast-based financing. And so that is a system really which complements IBF, I think, which can, based on early action, target funding and action where it is needed in at-risk communities and countries. Thanks, Robert. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about what happened in the UK in February. Like I said, it was the busiest period I can remember. We saw it coming, and that's one of the things that we can do these days in meteorology. We can spot these things coming several days, perhaps even a week or so in advance. And so we can really gear up our resources, our communication strategies. And what we did, so towards the middle of February 2022, we saw that a scenario which was developing in the large scale atmosphere, which I like to describe as a loaded gun really for the UK, where we have a 200-knot Atlantic jet stream, which is pointing straight across the Atlantic towards us. And typically that can bring us exceptionally disturbed weather. That's where we get our extreme explosive cyclogenesis type storms. And it looked like that was going to continue for some days. So we were expecting, and we eventually got, a spell of exceptionally disturbed weather. And indeed that affected much of Northwest Europe, not just the UK and Ireland as well. So we ended up naming 3 storms. That's the first time that that's happened within the space of a week since we introduced storm naming in 2015, 2016. We had a similar spell in the winter of 2013-14. So it seems to be a sort of once in 10-year type thing when we'll get successive severe storms. The storms that we saw in February 22, Storm Dennis, which affected Northern England, Southern Scotland, midweek, the 16th and 17th of February. That was the Wednesday and Thursday. Storm Eunice affected much of the southern part of the UK, which is less used to seeing storms, on the 18th of February, which is the Friday. And then following in behind that, we had Storm Franklin, which shifted back north again to affect Northern Ireland, parts of Northern England primarily, over the weekend and mostly on the Sunday, the 20th of February. So I want to give a quick bit of background about how the National Severe Weather Warning Service works in the UK. We have been impact-based for over 10 years now. We brought that in 2011 using the matrix-based system that you will be familiar with from the WMO guidance. Excuse me. So what we can do is cover warning polygons for any part of the UK. They're free polygons. We could just draw them wherever we want, really. They can be issued up to 7 days ahead. So that gives us a very long lead time for warnings. So we can issue low probability, high impact warnings of major events. We can issue them for 8 different types of weather, and indeed combinations of those. So we can have, you know, wind and snow at the same time in the same warning, for example. And of course, because it's an impact-based service, we are looking at both the impact and the probability. So it's not just what will happen, it's what might happen. And we're considering things like worst-case impact scenarios. And it is a single service. So the warnings themselves, they are exactly the same warnings that get sent to general public and the emergency responder community. And that's really important. So we've taken that decision for simplicity, for efficiency, but that means that any tailoring that we do has to happen downstream. Any of that adaptation, translation to different audiences happens outside of the warning service itself. So it means the warning service is surrounded by a lot of really complicated communications mechanisms which seek to reach all of these different audiences with the same underlying message in different ways. Thanks, Robert. So this is a fairly boring slide, but I think it is important to say what the Met Office's role is within the UK government resilience community. And we have a very specific role, which is set out under a piece of law called the Civil Contingencies Act, which defines what emergency responders are. The Met Office is itself not a responder, but emergency responders must take regard of the Met Office's warnings that we issue and our advice, actually. So responders are emergency services, local government, flood agencies, etc. And the whole of the UK, it's just shown England on the map there, is split up into regions in which emergency services are covered at local level. So it was really important that this was the main trigger for the Met Office becoming impact-based. We needed to provide that advice to national and local level to emergency responders in the UK. So we needed to make the warnings appropriate for that purpose. And we also needed a way of translating that information to a specialized emergency responder audience at local level. So that's why this was, as we call it, became impact-based. And it's also why we have my team of civil contingencies advisors. So it was a natural consequence of becoming impact-based is that we developed a team of 18 advisors who are embedded in all of these regional authorities, interpreting warnings and other weather information for them. So the communication role, having a dialogue with the customers, with the users, is really, really important as well. But it also enables us to get things done and to get people to act. Next slide, please, Robert. And I'll just give a quick plug for my team. As I said, we are a bridge between the Met Office and the emergency resilience community. And we are located all the way across the UK, covering Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And it is their job to work within the emergency services, translating that information, interpreting it, downscaling it for local level detail, local level sensitivities, but also feeding that information back to the Met Office to help us make those impact-based warning decisions. Okay, so that sets the scene. So the first storm happened on the Wednesday. We had some initial signs that something was going to look stormy the previous week. And indeed, that was when we started to send emails and talk to government around the potential for severe weather. Things started to become a lot clearer in the models over the course of the weekend. So on the Sunday and the Monday, we realized we had a really complicated story to tell. And it's important, and I think this is one of the messages of IBF, is that you need to think about a story. You need to think about the narrative about how all of this information and all of the warnings will play out in the media, how it will be responded to by the public over the course of several days. And that might include how the warnings will evolve, where we're expecting to go, and how people will react. So at that stage, early in the week, on the Sunday and the Monday, we realized that we were looking at least 2 storms. We knew that the first one was more certain, but wasn't likely to be that bad. It looked like a normal winter storm, like we'd had several already during the course of the winter. But the second one looked potentially much more severe. There was a lot of spread in the model still, but actually a lot of them were coming up with something quite nasty, in that it looked like it could be at least as bad as one of the storms in the winter of 2013-14, potentially even as bad as some of the storms we've seen before that. And in the UK, we talk about 1987 and 1990, where there was some very famous, very, very disruptive storms. So that was the meteorology side of things and looking at return periods in terms of wind strength. But we were also undertaking impact assessment, and there's a modeled element to that, but also it's a lot of talking to our partners in government and emergency responders, and indeed within the private sector. So it was clear that there was clear potential for severe power disruption, severe travel disruption, and storms that strong in the UK tend to kill, 10 people or so, 20 people. The biggest storms that we've had have killed up to 50 people. So we were looking at potentially multiple fatalities. It was another reason it was complicated is not just that it was different areas, but multiple hazards. So there were periods of really, really strong winds. There were periods of severe coastal flooding on parts of the West Coast in particular. There were some areas that were going to be affected by snow, and some of that snow could be really disruptive in areas which are not used to seeing snow, or low level, for example. And because there was rain involved, there was the potential for inland flooding. And all of this was happening at different times in different areas. So it's a really, really complex story to tell over the course of probably 5 or 6 days. And what we did is we got together very early in the week and discussed within the Met Office. We set up an incident management team. We started to think about communications and warning strategy. And we also started to talk to government partners, so central government, but also locally within the other nations of the UK as well. And together we came to a decision, is that we were going to be very clear and very, very assertive with communication. And we were going to use this as an opportunity to try and drive as much action as possible. And that was the steer we got from central government actually as well. So do what you can. The Met Office, they recognise, has massive reach. All of our other partners as well do, through our communications, and through combined action, we could make a real difference. So it's unusual to have such a well-defined story. It's unusual to think that there is something severe that we're telling people about so strongly, which is 4 or 5 days out. We decided to really go in strong with this, and it became a bit of a communications offensive, I would describe, not just by the Met Office, but all of our partners involved in resilience across the UK. We started off by a double naming. And I cannot emphasize enough, and I'm not just saying this because I'm involved in setting it up, how useful storm naming is as a vehicle for setting a narrative for impact-based warnings. It really helps set the scene, it helps frame them, it helps pull all of that story together in a way that can be easily visualized and shared amongst partners, particularly with social media in mind. So that really captured the intention of the public and media early on. The fact that we've never done a double naming, we named Dudley and Eunice at the same time. That really got people's attention. Something bad is going to happen here. We were also unusually open with the way that we thought things were going to develop. Our clear message to media and to resilience partners, okay, is that we're starting out with a yellow warning for a high probability, low probability, high impact event, but actually we think we'll end up with red warnings for this come the end of the week. And that's quite unusual for us to be that bold. We started briefing into local resilience groups and central government, and that was through my team. And through the course of 5 days, we did over 300 different meetings between the team. And that was at all levels of UK government and resilience. Again, keeping them informed as to what has happened, what will happen, what might happen, and at all points about the impacts. We were very strong with all our messaging on all Met Office channels. So again, reaching all of those different demographics, all of those different audiences in different ways. So web, app, social media, we did kind of live Q&A streams to reach the enthusiast meteorological community. We did TikTok, etc. So that's all on our own internal Met Office channels. But also the same message was agreed amongst all of our partners as well. So that's all our media partners. So that includes, the BBC and the other broadcasters in the UK. It was very, very locked together. Also, it's not easy for us to say do not travel in the Met Office. We don't have a legal mandate to do that, but actually other companies do in the UK. So those who are responsible for road and rail, for example. So the rail companies started to issue do not travel warnings. Also, electricity power companies started to warn people of likely power disruption and how they might keep themselves protected towards the end of the week as well. So it felt that very strongly, and this was the focus on Storm Eunice, which looked like it was going to be by far the worst event. The message was, take notice of this. There's a lot of bad weather this week, but it's going to get worse. You need to take action on Friday to protect yourselves, your families. You should not travel. You may well be subject to power disruption. Your trampolines in the garden will blow away unless you tie them down. Your garden fences will blow away, etc. Lots and lots of impact advice, lots and lots of advice on what people should do. And we've never done it as strongly as we did in February. Thanks, Robert. So this is what actually happened, really, really deep low, actually quite a complex multi-centered beast came across us on the Friday. And this was after Storm Dudley had affected more northern areas a couple of days before. The storm surge came in a couple of hours ahead of the wind, narrowly missing high tides and narrowly missing the threat of major coastal flooding. So that was a close shave, but a lot of action was taken in some of those coastal communities in western areas. Then the wind came in. We had a maximum gust recorded of 122 miles an hour on the Isle of Wight, which is an extremely exposed location where that is. But inland, we were getting 70 to 80 miles an hour gusts. And that's very unusual in southern England, including in the London area as well. And when that happens, a lot of disruption is caused, a lot of damage is done, people get killed, unfortunately, as well. So that's what happened. This is what we did with warnings. So as I said, we notified government 5 days in advance. Everything stood up in terms of emergency response across government at national and local level. We issued So the picture on the right is what the final warnings picture looked like, but that was built up over time. So we started off with yellow and amber warnings. We issued a high impact amber warning for the southern part of the UK 2 days in advance on the Wednesday. The messaging difficulty there was saying that, okay, this is an amber, but it is a high impact amber warning, and that is just as bad as a red warning. So that was a tricky thing to message, and people seemed to get it. Then we filled in some gaps in the highest risk areas. So this was the coasts of the Bristol Channel, where it was going to be windiest, and also where the storm surge and flooding risk was as well. So we filled that in by issuing a red warning on Thursday, which covered the Friday morning. And then overnight on the Thursday night into Friday morning, we issued another red warning covering southeast England. That was really important because that area there covers London. That whole warning area covers 20 million people. We've never ever issued a red warning for the London area before. But because of the groundwork that we'd done, the communications in the previous days, the amber warning, everything that had gone out on the broadcast media, it felt like people weren't surprised and that everyone was ready. And so that was so that was the southern half of the UK, and you can see we've also got multiple warnings covering northern areas as well for snow and wind, which makes it an even more complicated story to message. Thanks, Robert. Just to complicate things, we had the 2 storms either side, and I'm not going to go into any detail of these, but these provided an additional complication for messaging. So we have 3 storms eventually. It was making people focus that actually you need to take notice of the middle one. That's the really bad one. Thanks, Robert. Lots and lots of impacts. A major concert venue in London, the O2 Arena, had its roof blown away. Lorries blown over church spires, blown off churches, a massive amount of power outages. Over 1 million people, 1 million households were offline at one stage during the Friday. Unfortunately, there were 3 deaths in the UK and 1 in the Republic of Ireland as well. Did the warnings work? Yes. In terms of reach, at least anyway, we had massive social media presence, engagement across multiple channels. It is one of the highest days of traffic ever to the Met Office website and app, for example. We show that graph of the spike, which is the number of sessions accessed on Met Office, web, app, etc. So we've certainly got the message out, and that message was replicated across all of the other partner channels and broadcasters as well. So everyone was in no doubt that something was going on. Did they take action? That was the next question. Yes, most schools closed. The rail network was suspended. On that Friday, it felt like we'd been the cause of what was a mini lockdown, really. We're all used to those in another context at the moment, but it felt like for 12 hours or so, the south of the UK, everyone stayed at home. We do post-event surveys of these warnings, and a really important thing that we try to measure is the conversion rate of awareness into attributed action. And not only was the awareness of the warnings for Storm Eunice incredibly high, 98% amongst those surveyed, but actually the action taken, 85% of people were taking action, which is huge. And also importantly, 62% of those were saying that they had taken action directly because of having received the warning. And again, going back to that question about what a good warning looks like, that to me then looks like a good warning, in that we're translating all of that science and that meteorology and impact understanding into action taken. And I'm sure that saved lives, actually. So as I said, we had 3 deaths in the UK, 1 in Ireland. That's tragic, obviously, but the normal figure for a storm of that magnitude is considerably higher. I was expecting something like 20 people dead. So I'm convinced that really made a difference. So anyway, I've talked too long about that. So that's a brief discussion about what happened in February in the UK. I'm still recovering now. I needed a good lie down for a week after that. I just wanted to mention extra resources around the WMO guide and elsewhere. So imminently, very soon, we have an online training course coming out from WMO to take people through the IBF guides and applications and case studies, etc. We are building an online ecosystem. There was far too much content that we gathered for the guide to actually go in the guide itself. So all of that's going online on the WMO website, and we're continuing to collect case studies, papers, etc., to link into that. I will also mention a couple of other guides which come out roughly at the same time, and it tends to be the same people involved in all of them. And again, many of you will be on this call. So the High Weather Book Towards the Perfect Warning, and also the Red Cross Red Crescent Guide, The Future of Forecasts. And I feel they're all consistent, they all tie together, and contribute to this growing body of knowledge about impact-based forecasting. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Will. Thank you very much. So it's open for questions. So please do raise your hand, and we're looking forward to a good discussion. In the meanwhile, while we're waiting for questions, I might ask one, Will, and it's coming from personal interest of doing interdisciplinary research. You mentioned several times while working on IBF, you were getting involved with social scientists, and that kind of was creating new avenues. So just wanted to maybe ask for a reflection on what are some good practices of working in this type of interdisciplinary teams, because we all know it's sometimes very complex.
I think establishing those links between the disciplines is the most important thing, Robert. I mean, just my early experiences of partnership working in hydrometeorology, it was about establishing a common language between meteorology and hydrology to just make sure that we were talking about the same thing. And I think we're now in the same area when we're talking about the link between meteorology and social sciences. It's like we need to develop the discipline of sociometeorology and make sure that we're all talking about the same things. And so it's not, we're not just working in our silos anymore. And I think we're doing that. I think that's happening quite quickly.
Thanks a lot, Will. I see that Gordon has a question. Gordon, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting, Will. I don't know if you know who I am, but I used to be head of the Canadian Weather Service more than 2 decades ago, but we talked about these kind of things then. And one of the big challenges in Canada is what you were just talking about, is the misconnect between the hydrological forecasts, which are done by the provinces or local municipalities, and the federal government, which does the weather forecast. But I was going to talk until you just mentioned that, about the issue of bringing in the social sciences, which we've been trying to do. I work with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and we've been working on trying to understand how cities, focusing on the cities, actually cities at risk, what cities have you taken positive actions so that in this case to reduce their vulnerability overall, so that they're not quite as impacted when the events happen, and having information that could relate the forecast to that known set of vulnerabilities would I think help, wouldn't it? And if we did some of that mapping with cities in a positive way, looking into things and where they haven't taken action, because I just completed a study looking at building climate resilient communities in Canada, and the general assessment was that a lot of cities have taken action to reduce their climate, well, the effect of climate related events, but they usually do it after the event happens. And how can we motivate them to take the action before the event, so that we have actions now to prevent disasters in the future? And I guess the other comment I was going to make was that with these 3 events, you seem to say that connecting the 3 of them together may have led to a higher level of it. At least I sensed the response that was so high for I forget the name of which woman you gave the last one to, that had the impact, but in the 98% one. Anyway, did they, having already been sort of brought to alert by the previous 2 storms, were they more likely motivated then as opposed to otherwise? Or was that the right sequence?
No, well, it was the middle one that was worse. And actually, there's another story about Storm Franklin, because we really didn't see that coming until it was, at the time. So that wasn't quite so good, and there was some flood impacts from that. But it certainly helped to build that narrative. So if there's going to be a week of severe weather, but there's something bad at the end of it, I think it is best to talk about the whole week rather than just ignoring everything until Friday happens, I think. And it's putting the whole week into context, and it's difficult. So the regional differences, we got people saying, why haven't you named this storm for this day, because it's been really windy here in the south and you've only put a warning out in the north. And so compromises have to be made. You have to simplify the story in different ways, but I think you've got to try and inform people rather than not do that. And then to pick up on your other thing, Gordon, I think we need to go out and engage with these people and these communities which are not taking action, and find out why. And that can be difficult. I think we need to focus on the difficult stuff. Going out and finding these barriers to, as you said, the mapping. Because I'm going to trivialize this by saying I think we can do the science and we can understand the impact, but why aren't people taking action? And we need to go out and find that.
Yeah, well, the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Program, one of the co-sponsors of the RiskKAN, which I was its first scientific committee chair back in whatever it was, 2008. We had as one of our key project areas was called risk interpretation to action. How do people interpret risk based on that and their own social, cultural, whatever dimensions? Well, and we've seen this, and you were mentioning COVID. I think there's some interesting examples to do some comparison, because we've had in Canada recently these people with their trucks occupying downtown Ottawa and other places because they claim there's no evidence that this COVID is actually happening. And how do we get those people to understand the issues, and how do we motivate people to take action on climate change when there's still a certain amount of reluctance on that? And because we need to take actions now for an even worse future. The IPCC report that just came out, Working Group 2 report, a week or two ago, has some very strong evidence of what has happened and what even more will happen in the future in terms of these extreme events. And we need to start, ramping up the response in advance for that kind of thing. Anyway, I'll stop talking. It's other people's turn.
Arlene submitted a question in the chat. So the question is: a major challenge identified by Caribbean Met Services is having persons understand uncertainty. Mid-latitude weather is more predictable than tropical weather. Could you describe what would be public education campaign to explain several aspects of risks to the public, including the probabilistic nature of weather forecasts and the inherent limitations?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge, isn't it? Because to do the risk communication, we need to do the probabilistic communication, and it still feels that that's something that we are not as good as we should be at. And that's something that we need to understand the users more about. What is their capacity to understand probabilistic information? Going back to Gordon's point, I think we do have some opportunities through the risk perception and communication that we've done around COVID. And people, by and large, tend to get that kind of thing. I know there's hesitancy, etc. But I think we can build on that. I also think, and again, Eileen, I think there are some really good examples of that which are used routinely in the Caribbean and for other tropical cyclone forecasting, such as the use of cones, for example, which we tend not to do in the mid-latitude side of things. But that's a really, really good way of representing probability. Whether they're always understood as that is another question, whether people just take them too literally. But I think there is a lot we can learn from the way that we communicate hurricane risk.
Thanks, Will. I don't see any hands raised or questions in the chat, so I will ask another question. I'm just wondering, in terms of the data requirements for IBF, and especially for the impact side, I guess it's quite intense. So what about status of the IBF or future plans for IBF in geographical areas and countries where this data will not be easily available?
Okay, so I think it's really important that we understand that IBF as a philosophy is not dependent on your technical capability or data capability or anything like that. There is something there for everyone, and a lot of what is to do with IBF is to do with just reaching out to partners, having those communication links, sharing of information. And I think once you've got those fundamentals, and then you could start to build an IBF service. I think technology, access to data, impact data, whatever, is a bonus on top of that. It's not necessary, right? And there'll be different levels of resources available to all of our organizations in all of our countries. That should not be a barrier to embracing IBF principles.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Will. We have one final question by Bree. Will there be some analysis by EG Met Office or academia on clustering of storms and climate change?
We're getting a lot of questions around that. I suspect it's the same in all of our countries. The narrative which arose, particularly around extremes becoming more extremes and clustering in that way. So certainly looking at UK risk assessment, that's something we are looking closely at the moment. What are the trends in the next 5, 10, 20 years, etc., for a variety of risks? That might be storms, heat waves, etc. And indeed, the fact that they tend to cluster together, and the fact that some of the extremes that we see will be beyond our current experience. And again, that suggests that we probably need new ways to cope with that. Whether the current IBF methodology is geared up enough, or whether our organizations are geared up enough to be able to cope with these extremes or clusters of extremes, I think that's the next big challenge for us.
Thanks a lot, Will. Thank you very much for a great presentation and interesting discussion. And thanks everyone for joining. So we're continuing next, and Will kind of introduced already. So the book Towards the Perfect Warning, edited by Brian Golding, will be published in May, will be a topic of our next webinar that's going to happen in the last week of April. So please do follow the social media and the mailing list. We will be out with a date and time very soon. Thank you very much once again for joining, and have a great afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are.